From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. In recent days, Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte announced that he would withdraw his country from the treaty governing the International Criminal Court. That move came just over a month after the ICC's top prosecutor announced that she had opened a preliminary investigation into atrocities carried out as part of Duterte's war on drugs. Now, Duterte was elected in 2016 and had made clear that he would, quote, slaughter drug users in the Philippines. Few would say he hasn't tried to carry out that promise. According to Human Rights Watch, more than 12,000 alleged drug users or drug dealers have been killed in under 2 years. At least 4,000 have been killed by the police, and the rest by vigilante groups or other unidentified gunmen. While the body count climbs, Duterte's government is not only resisting international efforts to investigate the killings, it's also cracking down on the Filipino media for reporting on them. On this edition of Global Journalist, a look at death squads in the Philippines and government efforts to quash reporting on them. In a few minutes, we'll hear from a Filipino journalist who's been reporting extensively on this, as well as human rights and policy experts following this issue. First, we're joined by Maria Ressa in Pasig City, outside the capital, Manila. She's the chief executive officer and executive editor of Rappler, one of the largest news sites in the Philippines. Maria Ressa, welcome to Global Journalist. Well, it's great to have you. It's great to have you here, Maria. Tell us, your news site got its start about 6-7 years ago on Facebook. One of the stories that really, I think, brought your news site to the fore was covering the campaign in 2016, especially Rodrigo Duterte. But then after the election, your news site began having problems with him and with some of his supporters. Tell us about that.
So one of the things that happened with Rappler is it's a 6-year-old startup. We started it with 12 people. It quickly grew to about 100 people, which is the way we are right now. We wanted to use technology for development, and we used social media to scale fast. And we were also the first to feel the negative impact, the evil part of Facebook here in the Philippines. 97% of Filipinos who are on the internet are on Facebook. That is our public space. We covered Rodrigo Duterte like we covered every other candidate. And part of the reason that his social media campaign also took off was because of the exposure he got on Rappler. Soon after he won, however, he decided that he would boycott traditional media. That was exactly the time that the social media campaign machinery he had then pivoted and became weaponized. It very systematically attacked anyone who would question the drug war and bring up questions of extrajudicial killings. Those are the first targets. The second targets were journalists. And then the third was anyone who was perceived to be critical, opposition politicians. And that continued from July 2016 to about October 2016, which is when we published a series on the propaganda war in the Philippines on the internet.
Maria, if I could just back you up for a moment. You talked about like this social media machinery. What do you mean by that?
President Duterte is really the first politician in the Philippines to effectively use social media to win, and especially to win the presidency. They were able to use it from December to 2016, and then shortly after that to continue using the networks that were built then, and in a much more strategic way, in a way that has been described as patriotic trolling, to use online state-sponsored hate to stifle dissent. And that's part of what happened to us. We came out with a series that actually showed both quantitatively and qualitatively with data exactly how the campaign machinery was weaponized to attack perceived critics. And then after that, we were ourselves attacked. At a certain point in October, I was getting an average of 90 hate messages per hour. That's new, and it was something that we had to deal with and realize that the landscape had really changed.
And these hate messages, what did they say?
As vicious as it gets. Misogynistic, sexist, we will kill you, rape. Every time I show some of these messages, it's not something that was in our landscape in the Philippines before. And then what's happened is that women in particular are targeted, and some accounts, for example, are made up specifically for one target, and then they're taken down. Simultaneous to this was the rise of fake, I'm going to say fake news, but lies seeded onto websites that are then spread by Facebook pages that were part of the campaign. So now these pages, these content creators are working with the government. At the beginning, before some of them were appointed to government office, they were sympathetic. So it was unclear whether they were getting state funding. But by April of 2017, the key account, the key Facebook account, the anchor account in the mass base, an account of a singer who had almost 5 million Facebook followers, she was appointed head of social media for the presidential palace. So we know it's state-sponsored. We know it targets critics.
Well, you talk about lies and falsehoods. Give us an
right.
example or two of what types of lies and falsehoods are being spread from these official government accounts.
Well, an easy one. This was still during the campaign, right? One of the spokesmen of the then Mayor Duterte, the spokesman of the candidate, was talking about the drug war. So moving into the drug war and how human rights workers were bleeding hearts, and yet here is this picture of this young girl, and they don't do anything about it. This is what Duterte will stop. Except the journalist pointed out that the photo of the young girl was taken in Brazil. That's blatant. Other things
so
are,
using a photo from a completely
in
different
terms of
country to try to score political points then.
Yeah, absolutely. The attacks on Rappler are another example. One of the social media accounts that were sympathetic to the president, the person who is now appointed to handle social media, said Rappler, in question marks, is Rappler CIA? And then this theme evolved over the next few months until July 2017, when in the president's State of the Nation address, President Duterte himself then accused Rappler of being foreign-owned. That's a lie. And the cases that have been filed against us are based on that.
Yeah, talk to us. Our time does grow short, Maria Ressa, but if you could just talk briefly about how this has moved to legal and regulatory problems for your news site from sort of online trolling and attacks.
So I think the key thing is to see that the social media, this propaganda war, is only the first step. After that, President Duterte himself has attacked traditional and online news sites. He first attacked the Philippine Daily Inquirer for the kill list in the drug war, and then ABS-CBN, the largest television network, he threatened not to renew their franchise, and then finally focused on Rappler. Once he focused on Rappler, within a few days of that, we received our first show cause from the regulatory agency. Within 5 months, our articles of incorporation were taken away. Essentially, that's what we are now fighting for. It isn't final, nor is it executory, but we are now brought that to the Court of Appeals, and we are willing to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. Aside from that, there are 2 tax cases now that have been brought against Rappler, maybe about 5 government agencies. The National Bureau of Investigation, our version of the FBI, has called us in, I've answered 2 subpoenas. So these cases, on the face of them, just seem ludicrous. That's the way I've described them. Our lawyers describe them that way. But we have to deal with them.
Well, Maria,
the end goal, of course,
I'm
seems
sorry,
to be
we're just out of time here. It does sound like an extremely difficult situation, but thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
A reminder that this is Global Journalist. On today's program, a look at death squads in the Philippines and government efforts to silence reporting on the estimated 12,000 extrajudicial killings by police and vigilante groups there since 2016. We just spoke with Maria Ressa of the Filipino news site Rappler. For more on this subject, we're going to bring in Rica Concepcion. She's a freelance journalist in Manila who also works as a fixer for international news outlets like the New York Times, Reuters, and Time magazine. Rica, welcome.
Hello.
Well, tell us, if you would, about sort of the drug problem in the Philippines, which is, I guess, behind this drug war that has left so many people dead. I understand the main issue is the use of what's called shabu or methamphetamines. How widespread is that?
Okay, so before the entry of the present administration, Rodrigo Duterte, the methamphetamine is really became like a part of everybody's life. I mean, a lot of offices, or a lot of workers. There's mostly like truck drivers, taxi drivers. They're all like into this kind of drugs because it makes them awake the whole night. And all of a sudden, even in communities that you realize that when the price of the methamphetamine or shabu became very low, and that you can already access it with the pedicab drivers, like the tricycle drivers, then it's already a problem because it's really gone inside communities. So it was really a big problem.
Well, tell us what changed after President Duterte took office in 2016.
Okay, so before that, when he was campaigning and he already said something that he was going to fight drugs, we already had an inkling that there was going to be a lot of deaths, because that was a track record in Davao. So there was what they
That's the
called
city where he had been mayor
Davao.
previously.
Yes. And there was what they called the Davao Death Squad. And true to itself, the day after he was elected, so still wasn't president, already things were happening. People were getting killed. You'd see bodies dumped in the streets.
For you as a reporter, how difficult was it for you to go out and find these crime scenes and figure out what had happened?
Well, in the beginning, it wasn't really hard because there was a number of us, and just like going with the night beats, the police beats at night, you can follow all this. The problem is there were no names, because they're just there. They're just bodies on the street with a mark. So we didn't know who they were, whether they were really drug users. It's just that there's a board that says that they are, but we didn't know anything about them. But then as months came, when already the killings were happening in homes, or that you would already have families there at the crime sites, then you start hearing wails and cries and women saying, why did it happen, why did they get killed? So it elevated to a different thing. Then what happened is that the killings were happening already in the houses, and it was hard for us to access them because a lot of the crime scenes, or a lot of the victims that's being killed, are really from the poorest of the poor. So the houses are really like maybe dog houses. They're really very small that you couldn't fit in. So when the crime scenes happens inside the homes, it's quite hard for journalists to enter because the number of investigators and the scene of the crime, like the CSI guys, are already, the whole space is already filled up. So normally what we get is like we'd see the bodies being brought out by the care undertakers, and then we get to shoot the crime scene, but no more body.
Well,
So
my
it
understanding
became
is that
that
President
way.
Duterte has condoned a lot of this violence here, but part of what's interesting about this issue is that his approval ratings are very high in the Philippines. Most polls put him at 70 to 80% approval ratings. How do you explain this?
Well, there was really a lot of people who voted for Rodrigo Duterte. In fact, in the first months, a lot of the people that were getting killed had ballers or T-shirts that clearly states that they voted for the president, for Duterte, or that they were pro Duterte. We even had grandmothers saying that they voted for him, they believed in him. We met families who said that they never believed all the news that they'd watched, that people were getting killed, until it happened to their own family. It's really very hard because there's a lot of people in the social media, which is very popular here, that opposes. You get trolled, just like what Maria Ressa says. So when you post a photo, let's say on Instagram or on Facebook, you get trolled. We have photographers that, people would say, "Oh, I hope that your mother gets raped."
Huh.
I mean,
So it
only
sounds like
because
this
he shows.
social media disinformation campaign has had sort of wide and long-lasting effects then. But Rico, we're just out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A reminder that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about the Philippines, where President Rodrigo Duterte's drug war has left more than 12,000 people dead. If you're interested in more Global Journalists, check us out online at globaljournalist.org. You can also like us on Facebook, where we live stream, follow us on Twitter, or subscribe to our videocast on YouTube. To broaden our discussion now, we've got two other people who have been following the violence closely. Joining us from New York is Philim Kine. He's the Deputy Director of the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. And in Washington, D.C. is San-Ho Tree, the Drug Policy Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to both of you. Philim Kine, let me start with you. You were on our show about a year and a half ago talking about this issue in many of the same terms that we're hearing about today. What has changed since then?
Well, what's changed is that the killings continue and that there is absolute impunity for those killings. But I think the most remarkable development that's just occurred in the last 24 to 48 hours is that the government of President Rodrigo Duterte has announced that they will withdraw from the International Criminal Court. And this is a direct response and reaction to the fact that the International Criminal Court had opened a preliminary examination into potential crimes against humanity linked to this war on drugs. And so this is nothing less than Duterte seeking to evade justice. This symbolizes that this strong man is actually very fearful that he will have to account for his role in inciting and instigating thousands of deaths that has targeted some of the poorest, most vulnerable, marginalized people in the Philippines. We call it a war on drugs, but it's more accurate to call this a war on the poor. And it's still going on.
Well, San-Ho Tree, you heard Philim Kine talking about President Duterte's role in this. How clear is it that he is instigating the violence behind the violence? Could prosecutors draw a bright line between people dead in the slums of Filipino cities and the president?
Absolutely. Unlike other dictatorships where people have killed lots of civilians in death squad activities, this president has gone on air, on live television, and said these things repeatedly. He's called for the killings by police, by civilians, incitement to kill fellow citizens without due process. There's a long video and paper trail on this.
Well, I mean, we talked about this as death squads, which is something that many people may be familiar with from experiences in Latin America, in Brazil in the 1970s, 1980s. Is it fair to talk about what's happening in the Philippines as death squads? Are most of the deaths is it clear who's doing the killing?
I think a lot of these killings have been police shootouts, so-called resisting arrest, where they very often guns are planted after the fact, often in the wrong hands. If there's a right-handed shooter, it's planted in the left hand. There are handcuff marks very often, and those are police resistance killings. But then there are a lot more by so-called vigilantes, and there have been many, many, many journalistic accounts now, interviews with hitmen and women who are paid by police, sometimes $400 per hit, and these death lists, where there was no transparency of how you end up on one or how you get off of a watch list, and people turning up dead. So there is a very strong correlation between the rhetoric of the state and these deaths.
Well, Philim Kine, we heard San-Ho Tree talking about these death lists here, which is something that Human Rights Watch has tried to document as well. What do we know about who controls these death lists and how people's names get on them?
Well, I mean, what we know and what Human Rights Watch has documented extensively, as has Amnesty International and very courageous Filipino journalists and foreign correspondents, is that the police are absolutely involved in extrajudicial killings. As San-Ho mentioned, that they plant evidence at the scenes of extrajudicial killings. And the other thing is that there is a category that they like to use of these vigilantes. Well, our research and research of other credible researchers has determined that many of those killings are essentially police out of uniform or agents of the police. So this is very much a death squad conspiracy that has been incited and instigated from the very top of the government. And neither the government nor the police are willing or able to, number one, stop the killings and to provide the needed accountability and investigation into who's doing this, and in order for these people to be brought to justice.
Well, Sanho, we heard both Maria Ressa and Enrique Concepcion trying to explain some about why President Duterte is so popular, and they seem to attribute part of the reason to sort of the climate of online trolling and intimidation on Facebook that exists in the Philippines, which seems sort of extraordinary when you're talking about atrocities of this scale. Is there sort of a broader explanation for why the president has 70 or 80% approval ratings? At the same time, we have 12,000, 14,000, 20,000 people killed in extrajudicial killings.
I think he's offering easy answers to very complex problems that are rooted in structural and systemic failures of society, and projecting all the cornucopia of social ills and annoyances onto one particular demographic, drug users and so-called drug pushers. In many ways, it's not a genocide, but it's a forerunner to genocide in the sense that it reminds me very much of the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe of the 19th century, where the Tsar and his secret police, took a whole host of social ills and projected it onto one group, in this case Jews back then, and said it was okay to unleash holy hell on this one sector. So it's an eliminationist ideology. This is very much visceral-based drug policy rather than evidence-based drug policy. It's the conspiracy that says if we just got rid of this one group, things would be wine and roses again. And that's never going to work because there is no substitute for building a healthy society at the end of the day.
And Philim Khan, many of our audience will recall the end of the Marcos dictatorship in the 1980s, and Philippines has operated as a multi-party democracy since then. What sorts of checks exist within the Filipino system on President Duterte's power?
Well, the alarming thing about this, what's nothing less than a human rights calamity that Duterte has unleashed on the Philippines since he took office in June 2016. It's a triple-pronged threat. We have mass killings of the poor. We have a public health crisis because the prisons are overloaded with people trying to get off the streets to try to save their lives. And we have this war on accountability in which Duterte and his supporters have really targeted and punished any high-profile individual or groups who seek to challenge the government's narrative that it is pursuing a lawful anti-drug campaign. And Exhibit A of that is Senator Leila de Lima, who has been in jail on politically motivated drug charges for more than a year. What the government said, what Duterte's government is, the message it's sending is, if you challenge us, you will suffer. And that means that meaningful domestic opposition has essentially been eviscerated.
Well, Sanho Tri, Philim Khan mentioned the jailing of an opposition senator who had been investigating some of these human rights abuses in the Philippines. What other types of checks are there on the president's power? The Philippines is a heavily Catholic nation. What has the Catholic Church said about what's happening?
The church is slowly but increasingly speaking out against these killings. They're extrajudicial killings, of course. And other human rights groups. And it's an honor particularly to be on this show with Marisa and Maria and Rika. It's strong women in the Philippines who are really leading the opposition to this problem, as we see in the United States as well. It's the resistance being led by powerful women.
Well, Philim, my understanding as well is that human rights groups like your own, those conducting investigations for the UN, have also been targeted publicly by Duterte. He doesn't seem to hide who he doesn't like. Talk to us about how your group, how others have faced threats.
Well, there's been an interesting evolution in terms of Duterte and how his government has approached this killing campaign. They began in the first 6 to 9 months by proudly and zealously announcing how many people they were killing and promising to kill more. And what we've seen over recent months is a kind of a backpedal. So they have started to issue confusing and contradictory statistics about how many people have been killed, and they've started attacking the messengers, organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and journalists. And essentially, they've adopted a tactic of denial and distraction. What they want to do is they want to make it almost impossible to try to parse what is the reality on the ground and challenging the messengers and defaming them and impugning their credibility as a means to essentially protect themselves. And we've had the Foreign Secretary of the Philippines, Alan Cayetano, actually go to the United Nations in Geneva and say that their view of what's happening are what they're called alternative facts. It doesn't matter what the real facts are on the ground. Their idea of what's happening is what they want to present, despite any real credible evidence on the ground.
And President Duterte, he said this several months ago: I don't care about what the human rights guys say. I have a duty to preserve the next generation. If it involves human rights, I don't give a bleep.
Yeah, here's the thing. He does care. He does care what human rights organizations they say. He does care what the UN says. He does care what the ICC is doing. That's why he's desperately seeking to backpedal to get out of the ICC, because he knows and he dreads that accountability, that justice for this 18-month-long mass killing campaign is coming sooner or later, and whether he likes it or not.
Well, San Ho Tri, give us your thoughts on what role has international pressure played in changing sort of outcomes in the Philippines?
I think it's been incredibly important for it's not just a Philippine phenomenon. There's an axis of autocrats around the world, and they're using very similar tactics. And we see people in other countries trying to emulate or speaking admirably of the Philippine drug war. So we're starting to link these international forces together. President Trump has several times now in the past 2 months pointed to the Philippines, to Singapore, to China, countries that use the death penalty liberally, for instance, to deal with drugs, as a model he would like to see for the United States. We see this in Indonesia. There's talk of escalating their drug war as well. So I think this is really drawing attention internationally to the problem of using these strong-arm tactics.
So you're saying even though the Trump administration has been, or at least the president has been, supportive of some of these tactics, you're saying it actually has brought unwanted attention on Duterte then?
Exactly. I've been trying for a long time now to figure out how to get more international attention to this problem. And here there are these governments willingly standing up and pointing to the Philippines as a model to emulate somehow.
Well, Philim, our time does grow short. Give us, if you would, just a little bit about your thoughts about where this issue may be going. We've covered this issue now a couple of times. It seems to have grown worse. We're talking about 12,000, 15,000 people dead in a year and a half.
Yeah. Well, what we see is growing international concern about what's going on. We see the ICC has gotten involved. We have real credible and substantive moves toward a United Nations-led international investigation. And so this support from abroad is helping to empower and enable the domestic opposition, the people that Sanho mentioned, these strong women who are leading the charge against this murderous killing campaign that's targeting some of the poorest, most marginalized citizens. So, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Duterte is determined to hold on to power. He's determined to evade accountability, but, time is not on his side.
We're out of time for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA, Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Maria Reza, Rika Concepcion, Philim Kine, and San Ho Tri. Our assistant producers this week are Teodora Agarici and Rosie Belson, with supervising producer Idam Galan. Jiwan Choi is visual editor, Aaron Hay and Lauren Workman are audio engineers. Our director is Travis McMillan. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us.